This week we're going to be learning about imperialism, so let's start with a definition. So as you can see on the screen, the definition of imperialism is the domination by one country of another country, both politically, economically, and culturally. So you're going to see in the late 1800s into the early 1900s that the European countries are going to start to take over, and usually violently take over, places in Africa and Asia in order to dominate them politically, economically, and culturally. Now, some of the reasons that this was needed, and I use the word need in kind of quotes because I don't think it was truly needed, but one of the reasons Europeans did this was because the Industrial Revolution that had just occurred had given them extra materials, extra things that they had made that very quickly with all the new resources, and they were looking for new markets to sell their products to so that the Europeans could continue to make money. They were also looking for more raw materials to feed their machines of the Industrial Revolution. So places maybe that they could grow these raw materials fast, like cotton. So they're looking around Africa and Asia for possible places to sell their products, possible places to get more raw materials for their products. And so you kind of see a surge during this time period in imperialism, or building of empires. So there are three types of imperial control. The first one, and most restrictive for the actual colony being controlled, is when they are called a colony, when the Europeans actually directly send out government officials, governors, soldiers from the, we'll call it mother country, and they actually come into this area that they've taken over, and they set up the systems, the justice systems, the political systems, and it's all under the control of outsiders. That is a colony that is under direct rule. So France did this a lot because the areas they took over, they were having more of a problem working together with them. So France oftentimes had to set up direct rule and take the country over completely and then bring over the French to institute their control. Sometimes Britain is an example of a colony, sometimes would be under indirect rule. It gives the colony a little more freedom in that Britain might allow a previous leader of that country to stay in power. A lot of times we call them like a puppet government, in order for the British to not have to put as many resources and as many people into the controlling of its colonies. And that would allow it to control a lot more area and a lot more colonies, because they every once in a while will allow the local officials to maintain some of their power, and we would call that indirect rule. So it's a colony, but there were some that were ruled directly, and there were some that were given a little more freedom and were ruled indirectly. So we just went over the colonies. You can have direct or indirect. There's another form of rule that sometimes took place when colonies wanted more freedom, and Europeans felt like they needed to grant that, otherwise they were going to lose control. So eventually they might call them protectorates, meaning they would give the local rulers more power and leave them in place, and they would no longer call them colonies, but they'd say, hey, we're here to protect you, and we'll be here if you need us, but for the most part, we're going to let you run on your own. So Britain, in some areas where they felt like they could do that, they would allow their colonies to have more freedom. So examples like Canada, South Africa, and Australia, they were called protectorates, and had the people there kind of had a little bit more freedom and more power. Whereas other places where Britain had control, they would not allow protectorates. Maybe the least intrusive, but I don't know if you could evaluate it different ways, but one other form of imperial control is a sphere of influence. And these oftentimes are in Asian areas where the Europeans were struggling to completely control and dominate with their military might, because the Asian countries also had a lot of military might. And so they set up instead spheres of influence that allowed the Asian countries to have a little bit more control than even a protectorate or obviously than a colony would have. So it made it so that like Britain or France would have exclusive trading privileges with this area. So it really limits the economic power and control of these Asian countries, but it doesn't take over them politically. So it's more of like a imperialism, but an economic imperialism where you control all of their businesses and what they can trade and how much they can charge, but you allow them to have their local political leaders and to have their local military. And you only attack if you feel like your ability to trade and your specific sphere of influence is not working for you. So colonialism, or the idea of creating colonies, had been speeding up all the way back to that age of exploration, and I kind of changed it from the age of discovery to the age of conquering, but it had been speeding up since the late 1400s. Europeans had raced for overseas colonies. You had the growth of European commerce and trade worldwide, and you had a commercial revolution where goods and services were traded all over the world, and you had that Columbian exchange. All of these things had grown out of the late 1400s and had expanded. And then you had the problem of, like in the New World, for the Europeans, a lot of these countries went through their own revolutions and they got their freedom. So you have this new world like the United States of America that's developed, and you have Haiti that gets its independence, and most of the South American countries get their independence from Europe. And so now Europe's without colonies. And so they're going to start to look to new places like Africa and Asia to see if they can set up colonies there. So I mentioned this earlier, but the main motives for this late 1800s move towards imperialism, there's three main areas that we're going to talk about. Economically, why the Europeans would want to, again, try to expand their power, politically and socially. So let's start with the economic motives first. So the economic motives, like I talked to you right at the beginning, were really based in the results of the Industrial Revolution. So the Europeans are looking for places, we call them markets, to sell their finished products. They're also looking for sources of raw materials. For instance, Egypt had cotton, Malay had rubber and tin, and the Middle East had oil that would become essential in the early 20th century or the early 1900s. They're also looking to make investments and possibly to expand their factory systems. So they're looking for creating mines and railroads in unindustrialized areas so that they can bring more products to people and take more raw materials from people to their factories. So all of these reasons are going to combine to make looking in Africa and Asia for colonies important. There are also some political motivations in the late 1800s. The European countries are starting to develop this sense of nationalism or pride in their country, and they see the getting of colonies or attaining colonies in Africa and Asia as an example of the greatness of their country. So the more colonies you have, the stronger your country is, the better your country is. So the larger your empire is, the more national pride you will have. And we're going to get to how this will eventually lead to World War I. But this kind of attitude of growing and becoming more powerful and taking over other countries in order to increase your sense of national pride becomes very important. So the French are going to start to acquire lands in Africa and Asia for resources. You're going to see the British looking for naval bases in order to get to all of their different colonies that they are acquiring. And then you're also looking in these political motivations for soldiers that will help you to enforce and control your colonies, and sometimes to even fight other European countries to keep them out of your colonies. So the British had what are called the Indian sepoys. Those were indigenous Indians from India who were loyal to the British and who were employed by the British and by some of their the British East India Company, which was like it was helped by the British government, but it was a private organization that was making money in India. So they had their own soldiers to protect their economic interests there. The French also had their own North African troops that will be helpful in fighting the British when the British were trying to encroach on their colonies. So again, you're getting manpower, you're getting soldiers to protect your interests. You're setting up bases throughout the world to protect your interests, military bases. You are acquiring land for its resources, and you're creating these empires just because they increase your national pride. So some of the social motivations. Usually I talk about this and I call it the civilizing motivation, this idea that Europeans felt like by going out to the rest of the world, and specifically Africa and Asia, they were going to make those people better. And so we talk about the idea that they had a burden as a white man to make the world better through passing on their culture. So that's one of the major motivations. Another motivation, but not quite as important, was in some areas of Europe, you had a population surge, and some of those people were looking for economic opportunities in other locations. And so they took it as an opportunity to own land and to go somewhere else for, again, more economic opportunities. So surplus population is a social motivation as well. And then going along the lines of Europeans thinking they're better than other people and they have a culture that they want to pass on to other people. The Europeans also had a motivation to spread Christianity. We sometimes call it a missionary impulse. This idea that God had told them that they need to go out into the world and to make converts, to make people Christians. And so a lot of times the Christians would go first, and you'd have missionaries in these countries who would kind of lay the foundation for what would be the political and the economic reasons they would come later. So you definitely have religious groups that go in different places. And there was a whole movie that came out recently. I'm trying to remember what it's called, but it was about the first missionaries in Japan and how the Japanese actually executed them because they saw them as representing what would be an attempt to take over their country. So you've got social motives, you've got political motives, and you've got economic motives. And I like to summarize these with what I call the 3 C's. The reason they go is for commerce, Christianity, and civilization. So again, commerce having to do with trade, having to do with those economic reasons coming out of the Industrial Revolution. Christianity, helping you to remember that the Europeans thought that they were better than each other, or not each other, better than the other places like Africa and Asia, and so they felt like they needed to bring their religion there. And civilization, the idea that you have to make them, make the Africans and Asians more like your culture. So hopefully this helps you to understand the major motivations for 19th century imperialism, as well as understanding the different ways in which these Asian and African countries were controlled by Europeans. And then later this week, you're going to see how the Asian and African countries responded. And just so you know, they usually just didn't sit back and take it. There was a lot of fighting in order to get the Europeans to go away.